My name is Liam, and this message is a ghost. By the time you hear this, I won't exist. Not dead, erased. It started with a simple rule: trust the clock. But what do you do when the clock starts lying? When you see things that haven't happened yet? They offered me a fortune to cut down trees. I should have asked what the trees were growing through. The helicopter ride in was the last time the world felt solid. Below me, the Yukon was a brutal, beautiful masterpiece of jagged stone and endless pine, a landscape that had no interest in human survival. Then the geotemporal logging camp came into view, and the illusion of nature's dominance shattered. It wasn't a camp, it was a scar. A collection of sterile white modules connected by enclosed sky bridges, humming with a low electric thrum that seemed to push the wilderness away. It looked like a research station built for the surface of Mars, not a place to cut down trees. I'm an engineer by training. I see the world in systems, in cause and effect. I took this job for two reasons: the absurdly high salary that would vaporize my student loans, and the cutting-edge tech GTL was rumored to be using. I craved efficiency, logic, and order. The camp from the air promised all three. On the ground, the feeling was different. The air inside the main habitat module smelled of ozone and filtered oxygen, a stark metallic contrast to the crisp pine scent I'd left outside. The walls were a seamless off-white polymer, and the floors were pressure-sensitive, lighting up a soft blue path ahead of you. It was unnervingly quiet, the sounds of heavy industry completely muffled. The few other crew members I saw in the corridors moved with a strange economy of motion, their eyes focused forward, never making contact. They looked less like lumberjacks and more like technicians in a clean room, each lost in their own complex procedure. My orientation was conducted by a man named Kalen, the site supervisor. He was built like a traditional foreman, but his face was sharp and analytical, his company-branded overalls spotless. He didn't offer a handshake. "Welcome to Site B7, Liam," he said, his voice flat. He gestured for me to sit at a sterile metal table. A tablet screen glowed to life in its surface. "Your contract is for a 6-month rotation. Standard non-disclosure agreements apply. Your work will be demanding, but the protocols are in place for a reason. They ensure peak operational efficiency and, more importantly, cognitive stability." Cognitive stability, the phrase hung in the air. I'd expected warnings about frostbite or bears, not a clinical assessment of my sanity. "This isn't a normal logging operation," Kalen continued, his eyes fixed on the tablet. "The isolation, the extreme light cycles, they can affect perception. GTL has invested heavily in countermeasures. You will follow them to the letter. They are not guidelines, they are functions of your employment." He swiped the screen, and a document titled Cognitive Anchoring Protocols appeared. It was a long list filled with technical jargon. It was less a set of camp rules and more like a pre-flight checklist for the human mind. "Read them, memorize them, live them," Kalen said. "Your life and the integrity of this operation depend on it." He stood and left without another word, the blue path on the floor illuminating his exit. Left alone in the silent room, I scrolled through the protocols. My engineering brain kicked in, trying to deconstruct the logic behind each one. Most were mundane, related to equipment maintenance and safety, but then there were the others, the ones that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Protocol 3. At the conclusion of each work shift, you are required to record a verbal entry into your personal log. This entry must state the current date, the exact time, synchronized to the central chronometer, and one verifiable, sensory-rich memory from your life prior to your arrival at GTL. The memory must be different each day. Purpose? To reinforce temporal and personal identity baselines. My first thought, a clever psychological trick, forcing us to anchor ourselves in our own history to fight off the disorienting effects of the environment. Smart. Protocol. TB. All personnel are to maintain a minimum distance of 5 meters from any exposed sap of a silver-barked birch. Direct skin contact with the sap is a Level 2 biohazard event. In the case of accidental contact, you are to immediately cease all work, engage your emergency beacon, and proceed directly to the on-site decontamination unit. There are no exceptions. This one seemed more straightforward. The sap was likely a powerful hallucinogen or neurotoxin, a logical, if extreme, safety measure. Protocol 11E. You are prohibited from bringing personal timekeeping devices into the field. All timing will be managed by your company-issued chronometer, which is hard-linked to the central camp clock. Any perceived audio or visual phenomena not corroborated by at least one other crew member must be logged as a sensory artifact and disregarded. This was standard procedure in sensitive research environments to prevent data leakage. But sensory artifact, it was such a sterile, dismissive term for a hallucination. Protocol 14C. If your company-issued chronometer displays a temporal discrepancy of more than 0.5 seconds, when compared to a visible check of the central camp chronometer, you are to power down the device immediately. Do not attempt to reset it. Return to base using only your magnetic compass and physical map. Trust the compass. Do not trust your sense of direction. Report the device for immediate recalibration. This was the one I couldn't crack. Half a second. The acceptable margin of error for even the cheapest digital watch was smaller than that. Why would a state-of-the-art device hard linked to a central clock ever drift by such a massive amount? And the instruction to trust a primitive magnetic compass over my own senses. It felt like a line of code from a corrupted program, a bug in the system. But I rationalized it away. Maybe extreme magnetic fields in the area played havoc with electronics. It was a weak theory, but it was the only one my logical mind could produce. The first few days were a blur of intense, repetitive work. I operated a cutting-edge harvester, a sleek, 8-legged machine that could fell, delimb, and section a tree in under a minute. The work was isolating. Communication with the crew was minimal, restricted to operational necessities over the comms. We were cogs in a vast, efficient machine, and the forest fell before us in silent, pre-calculated swathes. Each night, I would stand before my cabin's terminal and perform the anchoring ritual. Date, October 3rd, 2025. Time, 18:17. I remember the smell of burnt sugar and cinnamon at the state fair when I was 10. I remember the sticky feeling of cotton candy on my fingers and the loud, chaotic music of the tilt-a-whirl. It felt foolish, but I followed the rules. I was a good cog. The incident happened on my 5th day. I was tasked with clearing a new sector, a dense grove of younger trees, many of them the silver-barked birch mentioned in the protocols. I was careful, my harvester's claws grabbing the trunks and severing them cleanly at the base, keeping the oozing, shimmering sap far from the cockpit. I cleared the entire designated grid, section by section. My logs were meticulous, the GPS mapping showing the area as 100% cleared. I specifically remember cutting down a small, lone silver sapling at the far edge of the grid, right next to a distinctively shaped granite boulder. I logged it and moved on. The next day, my assigned grid bordered the one I had cleared previously. As I maneuvered the harvester into position, I passed by that same granite boulder, and I froze. Right where the sapling had been, there was another tree, a silver-barked birch. It wasn't a sapling, though. This one was thicker, taller. It had what looked to be at least a full year's growth on it, maybe more. My mind raced through the possibilities. I missed it. Impossible. My logs and the harvester's scanner data confirmed the clearing. The system doesn't make mistakes like that. Another crew planted it. Why? For what purpose? It defied all logic of our operation. We were here to clear, not to plant. I'm in the wrong place. I checked my navigation. The GPS coordinates were exact. This was the spot. The boulder was my landmark. I got out of the harvester, a flagrant violation of protocol, but I had to see it up close. The ground around the tree was undisturbed, no signs of recent digging. It was as if it had been there all along. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine, a feeling that was utterly illogical. It was just a tree. There had to be a rational explanation. A prank by the veteran crew members, maybe? A test of some kind? I convinced myself that was it. It had to be a joke. I got back in my machine, filed the event in my mind under unexplained but likely trivial, and got back to work. But the image of that tree, older than it should be, existing where it shouldn't, was burned into my thoughts. That evening I finished my shift, exhausted. I guided the harvester back to its docking station, and began the trek across the compound to my habitat module. The central chronometer, a massive digital display on the main tower, was visible from everywhere. Its cold red numbers governed our entire existence here. I unsealed the cuff of my worksuit to check my personal chronometer, the one issued by GTL. My internal clock felt like it was time to clock out. The display on my wrist flickered to life. 18:09. I looked up at the tower, and my heart stopped. The giant red numbers on the central chronometer read 17:59:59. For one full eternal second, my wrist and the entire world were out of sync. It wasn't just that I saw two different times. I felt it. A profound, gut-wrenching lurch, as if the universe had tripped over itself. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, and a wave of vertigo washed over me so intensely I had to brace myself against a railing. It felt like my brain was a frame of film that had slipped out of the projector's sprockets, showing a different reality from the one the rest of the world was watching. Then, with a heavy, final-sounding thump that I felt more than heard, the number on the tower clicked over. 18 Zuki. Everything was normal again. The times matched. The ground was solid. But the feeling of that fundamental wrongness lingered. Protocol 14C screamed in my mind. If your chronometer displays a temporal discrepancy, return to base. Trust the compass. Do not trust your sense of direction. I had seen it. I was sure of it. But was it real? Or was it the first sensory artifact? The first sign that the isolation was winning? That my own mind was becoming an unreliable narrator? They tell you that time is a constant, a river flowing in one direction. But what if it's not? What if, out here in the deep wilderness, it stutters? What if it breaks? They say time flies when you're busy, but what if it glitches? And what if you're the only one who feels it? If you've ever had a moment of déjà vu so strong it made you question everything, hit that like button and subscribe. You have no idea what these clocks are truly counting down to. My heart was a frantic, unsynchronized drum against my ribs. Protocol 14. C wasn't a suggestion. It was an order drilled into me, a line of emergency code. I powered down my wrist chronometer. The screen went dark, taking its false reality with it. My hand was shaking. I fumbled in my pack for the physical survival kit, my fingers closing around the cold, reassuring plastic of the magnetic compass. The needle quivered, then settled, pointing to a truth that was independent of any circuit board. North was still north. At least, I hoped it was. The walk back to the central module was the longest of my life. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper a half-second behind its sound. Every crunch of my boots in the permafrost felt like an echo of a step I had already taken. I ignored it. I dismissed it as paranoia, as my mind playing tricks in the wake of the initial shock. I was an engineer. This was a hardware failure. A fascinatingly precise and unsettling one, but a hardware failure nonetheless. I clung to that thought like a lifeline. I found Kalen in the operations hub, a circular room dominated by a holographic map of the logging sectors. He looked up from a console, his expression one of faint annoyance at the interruption. "Liam, you're off schedule," he stated, not asked. "My chronometer, sir," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. It registered a temporal discrepancy. Protocol 14C. I held out the powered-down device. Kalen took it without a word, his movements efficient and detached. He slid it into a diagnostic port on the console. A series of complex data streams scrolled across the screen. He watched them for a moment, his jaw tight. "I see the event log," he said, his tone making it sound as mundane as a software update. A positive drift of 1.034 seconds, followed by a system-initiated hard sync. The EM fields generated by the planetary core are unusually active in this quadrant. It can cause quantum jitter in the cesium oscillators of the portable units. It's a known variable, quantum jitter. He had a name for it. A clean scientific label to slap onto a moment of reality-bending vertigo. He made it sound like static on a radio. The feeling, though, I pressed, feeling foolish. It was a powerful sense of disorientation, vertigo. Kalen's gaze finally met mine, and there was nothing in it. No empathy, no concern, just assessment. Sensory fatigue is a common side effect of prolonged exposure to this environment, Liam. The anchoring protocols exist to mitigate that. Get a full 8 hours of sleep. Log a strong memory tonight. The recalibration unit will have your chrono ready by 06 Gare. He dismissed me. Just like that. I was a faulty sensor that had been noted and sent for repair. As I walked away, a cold certainty settled in my gut. He was lying. Not about the technical details, those were probably true, but about the significance. That wasn't a bug. It was a feature of this place, and his job was to make sure I never thought about it again. But you can't unfeel something like that. The next few days, I became a ghost in the machine. I did my work with robotic precision, but my senses were on high alert, scanning for the next inconsistency. And I found them. They were small at first, like hairline fractures in the surface of a mirror. In the mess hall, I'd reach for the salt, only to hear the man next to me, a hulking, silent man named Griggs, mutter, "Pass the salt," a second after my hand was already moving. He'd give me a strange, sideways glance, and the other crew members at the table would suddenly find their food intensely interesting. I started hearing things, not voices in the woods, nothing so crude. I'd hear the hiss of a hydraulic line a moment before it engaged. I'd hear the clatter of a dropped tool on the comms, and then, seconds later, the actual sound would echo through the cockpit, accompanied by a curse from the operator. They were like auditory ghosts, echoes of the immediate future bleeding into my present. I tried to log them as sensory artifacts, as the protocol demanded, but the log entries felt like a lie. These weren't artifacts, they were data points. And the data was pointing to a conclusion my rational mind refused to accept. The flow of time here was not stable. It was porous, leaking. The real shift happened during a sudden squall. The sky turned a bruised purple in a matter of minutes, and a ferocious wind tore through the sector, whipping snow and ice sideways. Visibility dropped to near zero. Company policy was clear. In a whiteout, you power down your harvester and wait. I was finishing a cut on a large silver birch when the storm hit. As my machine's massive shears bit into the trunk, a violent gust of wind caught the upper branches. There was a sickening crack, louder than the storm, and a massive limb broke free, swinging down like a pale scythe. I reacted on instinct, throwing the harvester into reverse. The branch slammed into the ground where my cockpit had been seconds before, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Adrenaline coursed through me. In the swirling chaos, I didn't see the smaller whip-like branch that lashed out from the falling limb. It struck my harvester's arm, and a piece of shrapnel from the impact tore a small gash in the reinforced fabric of my worksuit, right on my forearm. Before I could register what had happened, something cold and thick seeped through the tear. I looked down. The sap, the silver birch sap. It wasn't watery. It was viscous, opalescent, like liquid moonlight. It shimmered with an internal luminescence, and it was shockingly cold against my skin. Protocol 8B flashed in my mind, a blaring red alarm. Level 2 biohazard. Engage emergency beacon. Proceed to decontamination. I looked out at the raging blizzard. I was miles from the base. Engaging my beacon would trigger a full-site emergency. A recovery team would have to risk their lives in the storm, all for a few drops of tree sap. They'd ask questions. I'd have to explain my proximity to the tree. I'd be scrutinized, analyzed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that drawing that kind of attention here was a very, very bad idea. So I made a decision. A logical, foolish, and ultimately fatal decision. I broke protocol. I retracted the harvester's arm, grabbed a sterile wipe from my medkit, and frantically scrubbed the sap from my skin. It came off, but it left a strange, tingling numbness behind, and the skin underneath had a faint, silvery sheen that didn't seem to wash away. I sealed the tear in my suit with emergency bonding tape, my heart pounding with the guilt of my transgression. I told myself it was fine. It was a minor exposure. I would be fine. I was wrong. The sap was not a toxin, it was an accelerant. The subtle temporal leaks became gaping holes. The auditory echoes were now full-blown conversations I was having with myself, playing out a dialogue with a crewmate in my head, only to have the exact same conversation, word for word, happen 5 minutes later. The visual stutters were worse. I'd see a man walk across the corridor, a faint, translucent afterimage trailing a half-second behind him. The world was delaminating, splitting into layers of now and a moment from now. My isolation became absolute. The other crew members, who had been merely quiet before, now actively avoided me. If I entered the mess hall, conversations would stop. Men would get up and leave their half-eaten meals. Their faces held no malice. They held something far worse. Fear. It was the cautious, wary fear an animal has for a sick member of its herd. They saw something in me, in my eyes, in the way I moved, that marked me as wrong, contaminated. My engineering mind refused to break. It did the only thing it knew how to do. It tried to solve the problem. I started a new log, a secret one, on a heavily encrypted personal tablet I'd smuggled in against regulations. I called it the B7 Dissonance Index. I documented every single event, no matter how small. I noted the time, the location, the weather, the proximity to silver birches. I created graphs, trying to find a correlation, a pattern in the chaos. I was trying to debug reality. The tingling on my forearm never fully went away. It would return at odd times, a faint cold hum beneath my skin. And when it did, the phenomena would spike. One evening, as the feeling intensified, I was putting my tools away in the workshop. I placed a heavy wrench into its designated slot on the wall rack. I turned to grab a calibration tool from the bench, and when I turned back, the wrench was on the bench, right where I was about to reach. I hadn't just seen an echo of the future. I had physically experienced an event out of order. My meticulously constructed world of logic and reason was crumbling to dust. The breaking point came late one night. I was in my sterile white bunk, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The low hum of the compound was the only sound. The cold tingle started in my arm, but this time it was different. It spread, a wave of icy numbness moving up my shoulder into my neck. The world didn't just stutter, it dissolved. I was no longer in my bunk. I was standing in the forest, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and ozone. It was night, but the colossal silver birches around me glowed with a soft, internal light. My hands were braced against the trunk of one, and I could feel a slow, deep thrumming in the wood, like a sleeping heartbeat. My fingernails were caked with dirt. Then the perspective shifted. I was looking through someone else's eyes, at a medical bay. Dr. Aris, the site's quiet, perpetually exhausted physician, was looking back at me. Her expression, it wasn't pity, it wasn't concern. It was a kind of weary, clinical resignation, the look a researcher gives a failed experiment right before they document its disposal. The vision twisted again. I looked down, at my own hands, but they weren't my hands. They were weathered, older, the knuckles swollen. Hand crisscrossing the skin were dozens of fine, faint scars that shimmered like silver thread. The nails were broken, embedded with the same dark soil I had just smelled. A wave of absolute, soul-crushing terror washed over me. These were the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime clawing at the earth. With a choked gasp, I was back in my bunk. The room was the same. The low hum was the same. I frantically held up my hands in the dim light. They were my own. Young, pale, unscarred. But I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't a hallucination. It was a memory of a future that was now hurtling toward me. The sap hadn't just made me perceive time differently. It had somehow connected me to it. To him. To the man I was going to become. A cold, horrifying clarity washed over me. The protocols, the isolation, the clinical detachment of the staff, it all made sense. The cognitive anchoring protocols weren't meant to stop this from happening. They were designed to measure and manage its progress. This job wasn't about logging wood. The crew, the desperate men they lured here with impossible salaries, we were the resource being harvested. And I had just failed my quality control inspection. The answers I needed weren't in their carefully crafted rules. They were in the secrets the rules were designed to protect. They were buried in the GTL system, and I was going to dig them up. My fear was being replaced by something else, something cold and sharp. The defiant logic of an engineer who had finally found the ghost in the machine, and I was going to tear it apart, piece by piece. The vision of my own aged, silver-scarred hands didn't break me. It forged my terror into a new, chillingly sharp instrument. Fear was no longer a debilitating fog. It was a lens, focusing my entire being on a single, desperate objective. I was trapped inside a black box, a system whose inputs and outputs were deliberately obscured. My only way out was to find the source code. My nights transformed. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford, a state where the temporal dissonance ran rampant and unchecked. Instead, I turned my sterile habitat module into a digital war room. The company-issued terminal was a locked garden, useless. But the personal tablet I'd smuggled in, the one I used for my dissonance index, became my weapon. Hacking geo-temporal logging wasn't like in the movies. There was no frantic typing against a ticking clock. It was a slow, methodical siege. I started by mapping the camp's internal network architecture, a process made easier by my engineering background. The system was robust, a fortress of enterprise-grade firewalls and encryption. But every fortress has a postern gate, a forgotten drainpipe. I wasn't looking for the front door. I was looking for the cracks left by human error. My own fractured perception became a strange paradoxical asset. I'd be tracing a data packet's route and suddenly get a flash, a transient image of a line of code from a different subroutine I hadn't even accessed yet. It was like my mind was a faulty processor, occasionally executing instructions out of order, granting me glimpses of data I shouldn't have been able to see. I was using the system's own temporal contamination against it. My first breach was ridiculously simple. GTL, for all its futuristic technology, still relied on human technicians for physical maintenance. I observed their routines. A network admin named Calloway had a habit of leaving his terminal logged in when he went to the mess hall for his morning coffee. It was a 2-minute window. I manufactured a reason to be in the operations hub, feigning an issue with my harvester's telemetry. The moment he walked out, I was at his console. 2 minutes was all I needed to plant a low-level keylogger disguised as a diagnostic utility. It was a crude tool, but it was a foothold. Within a day, I had what I needed, Calloway's credentials. They didn't grant me access to the high-level research data that was locked down tight, but they opened up the mundane, sprawling archives of the facility's day-to-day operations, personnel files, work rosters, incident reports. It was a digital mountain of corporate bureaucracy, and I began to dig. My first search was for the man I replaced. His name was Elias Vance. I found his file. It was a shell. His photo was a grey silhouette. His personal details were replaced with data expunged. His employment record was pristine, full of commendations, right up until the last entry. Termination code, to be voluntary, psychological. It stated he had resigned due to the acute pressures of isolation and was safely transported back to the mainland for treatment. The date of his resignation was the day before I arrived. It was a neat, tidy lie. I started digging for the employees before him. The man who held my post a year ago, a geologist named Kenji. The woman before him, an ex-military surveyor named Aisha. File after file told the same story. Model employees all terminated under the same voluntary code, their records scrubbed clean. But the metadata, the digital fingerprint left on the file itself, told a different story. I noticed a pattern in the timestamps of the final file modifications. Elias Vance's record was wiped at 03 Guars on a Tuesday. Kenji's was purged at 03 Guars on a Saturday. Isha's, 03 Guars on a Wednesday. The procedure was always run in the dead of night. It was an automated process, a cleanup script. Then I saw the truly disturbing trend. I calculated the duration of employment for each person who held my job title over the last decade. 10 years ago, the average rotation was 2 years. 5 years ago, it was 1 year. The last 3 employees, including Elias, hadn't even lasted their initial 6-month contract. The half-life of a B7 engineer was shrinking. Whatever was happening out in that silver forest, its effects were accelerating. GTL wasn't just managing it, they were losing control. My search for personnel files was a dead end. The records were too clean, too deliberately sanitized. So I changed my approach. I wouldn't look for the people, I would look for the system that erased them. I dove into the IT department's maintenance and server logs. These were the digital equivalent of a mechanic's greasy rags, terabytes of automated reports, error codes, and conversations between technicians that no one ever bothered to delete. For days I sifted through this digital sludge. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, and my temporal dissonance was worsening. I'd be reading a log from last year and suddenly smell the ozone from a storm that was still hours away. But I pressed on, fueled by a certainty that the truth was here, buried under layers of the mundane. And then I found it. It was a support ticket thread between two senior system administrators, one on site and one at GTL's corporate headquarters. The subject line was innocuous: local server sync anomaly. B7 admin, Callaway. Got another one. Index 7. Requesting authorization for phantom purge as per directive 734. HQ admin, J. Osei. Again? That's the third this quarter. Is the new gen of screening protocols failing? B7 admin, Callaway. The screening can't account for exposure variables. This one progressed faster than the models predicted. We have chronic temporal dissonance confirmed by Medbay. HQ admin, J. Osei. Understood. Make sure the transport is logged as a supply run. Don't want another paper trail incident like Q2. Authorization granted. Execute the ghost protocol, and Callaway, make sure you scrub the local session logs this time. Properly. Ghost protocol. The word sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It wasn't just a cleanup script. It was a named procedure, a formal established mechanism. Chronic temporal dissonance, CTD, that was me. That was my condition. They had a name for it. They had a model to predict its progression. I searched the entire network for the term ghost protocol. Most of the references were protected by security clearances far beyond Callaway's, but I found one hit, buried in a backup archive of a decommissioned server. It was a fragmented document, a technical manual with corrupted sections. The title was clear: Containment and Mitigation, Ghost Protocol, CTD-7. With trembling hands, I began to piece together the fragments. It was not a medical document, it was a disposal procedure, a flowchart for how to erase a human being. Phase 1, identification and confirmation. When a subject exhibits persistent CTD symptoms, verified by both self-reporting logs and covert biometric monitoring, Medbay is to confirm the diagnosis. Key indicators include temporal echoes, predictive flashes, and significant desynchronization between personal and central chronometers. They were watching me. The innocuous sensors in my habitat module, the daily check-ins, it was all part of the monitoring system. They knew I was contaminated long before I handed Kalen my chronometer. Phase 2, psychological isolation. Upon confirmation, crew members are to be subtly instructed to minimize contact with the subject. This social quarantine prevents the potential for mimetic transfer of temporal dissonance and primes the subject for Phase 3 intervention by increasing psychological distress. The averted eyes, the sudden silences in the mess hall. It wasn't just fear. It was a company-mandated shunning. They were turning my own crew into a weapon against me, deliberately driving me into a corner. Phase 3, intervention and sedation. Dr. Aris will approach the subject under the pretext of offering an experimental treatment or anchoring agent designed to alleviate symptoms. The agent, classified anchoring agent gamma, is a powerful, fast-acting neuroleptic and sedative. Its purpose is to render the subject compliant and amnestic for transport. The vision. Doctor. Aris looking at me with that resigned expression. The cure she was going to offer me was the final trap, a chemical straitjacket disguised as a helping hand. My own premonition had been a warning of my scheduled capture. Phase 4, relocation. The sedated subject is to be transported to the pre-designated quarantine zone, see Appendix C, map coordinates redacted. The transport must be logged as a cargo transfer or geological survey to maintain operational integrity. This was the part that made my blood run cold. They weren't killing us, not directly. They were taking us somewhere, a place not on any map, a dumping ground for their human refuse. Phase 5, the Phantom Purge. Upon confirmation of successful relocation, the on-site administrator will execute the Ghost Protocol. This digital process erases all local network records of the subject's employment and existence. The erasure is then back-propagated to GTL corporate servers, creating a seamless, verifiable fiction. A backdated termination report, standard reason, psychological withdrawal, is generated and filed. The subject officially no longer exists within the GTL framework. I leaned back in my chair, the cold metal pressing against my spine. The room felt like it was shrinking, the sterile white walls closing in. The low hum of the compound, once a sound of advanced technology, now sounded like the purr of a vast, indifferent predator. The horror of it was not in its violence, but in its efficiency. It was the horror of a balance sheet, of a corporate policy designed to mitigate liability. We weren't employees, we were liabilities. When our minds became too corrupted by the very environment they'd placed us in, we were reclassified as a data breach, a problem to be isolated and deleted from the system. Elias Vance, Kenji, Isha. They weren't ghosts. They were redacted lines in a server log. My hands shook as I stared at the fragmented protocol on my tablet. The true rules for survival here had nothing to do with bears or frostbite. Rule 1. Don't get noticed. Rule 2. Don't show symptoms. Rule 3. Don't trust the doctor. I had broken all three. A wave of temporal dissonance washed over me, stronger than ever before. For a split second, the screen of my tablet flickered, and the text of the Ghost Protocol was replaced by a single, stark entry from my own dissonance index, dated 3 days from now. It read, "They came for me tonight." I should have run sooner. The vision vanished, leaving me breathless. The premonition wasn't a possibility anymore. It was a scheduled event. My secret investigation hadn't saved me. It had merely allowed me to read my own autopsy report before the fact. Then a sound cut through the silence, a soft, polite, perfectly timed knock on my cabin door. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't the heavy, calloused knock of a lumberjack. It was a light, clinical rap, the sound of procedure, the sound of a doctor making her rounds. I looked from my tablet, with its blueprint of my own erasure, to the sealed door of my module. The blue guide light on the floor outside my door pulsed, a calm, steady heartbeat leading directly to me. The system had come to collect its corrupted file. The knock on the door was not a sound, it was a verdict. Every circuit in my brain fired at once. My premonition hadn't been a warning about 3 days from now. It had been an echo of this exact, immediate moment, the temporal distortion compressing my future into a single terrifying point of impact. They weren't coming for me. They were here. My body moved before my mind could fully process the terror. I didn't answer the door. I lunged for my personal tablet, shoving it into a hidden compartment in my pack alongside the magnetic compass and a high-density protein bar. My hands moved with a frantic, desperate energy, a primal survival instinct overriding the engineer's impulse to analyze. Another knock, a little more insistent this time. "Liam, it's Dr. Aris. Kaylin asked me to check in. Your biometric readings are showing a significant stress anomaly. May I come in?" Her voice was a perfect imitation of calm concern, a clinical melody designed to soothe a cornered animal before sedation. The Ghost Protocol. Phase 3. Intervention. I looked around my small, sterile room. There was no escape. The window was a triple-paned pane of reinforced polymer, designed to withstand 100 degrees of temperature differential and the impact of a charging moose. There was only one door. The lie came to me in a flash of inspiration, a spark of defiance in the face of absolute dread. "Just a moment, Doctor," I called out, forcing my voice to sound strained, as if I were in the tiny bathroom. "Stomach bug, I think. Must have been the reconstituted stew." I heard a soft sigh of feigned sympathy from the other side. "I have something that can help with that. Just open the door." "I'll be right there," I promised. While I spoke, I was tearing the cover off a maintenance panel near the floor, my fingers fumbling with the clips. Behind it lay a nexus of fiber optic cables and power conduits. My mind, sharpened by adrenaline, saw not a utility panel, but an opportunity. I grabbed my multi-tool and with a single decisive motion, severed the main data cable connecting my habitat module to the central network. The room plunged into a disorienting, momentary darkness. The emergency lights, running on a separate power source, flickered on a second later, casting the room in a hellish crimson glow. The low hum of the compound died, replaced by an unnerving silence. More importantly, the electronic lock on my door was now just a dead piece of metal. "Liam?" Dr. Aris's voice was sharp now, the professional mask slipping. "What's going on? Report." I could hear the faint click of her trying to use her keycard on the now useless lock. I didn't answer. I braced myself, took a deep breath and slammed my shoulder into the door with every ounce of my weight. It didn't budge, but on the third desperate attempt, I heard a crack. The dead locking mechanism, no longer supported by its magnetic clamps, splintered from its housing. The door swung open. Dr. Aris was standing there, a hypospray clutched in her hand. For a split second, her face was a mask of pure shock, her plan completely derailed. That second was all I needed. I pushed past her, not even trying to fight, just using her surprise to get into the corridor. I sprinted, the emergency strobes painting the sterile white walls in frantic repeating strokes of red. An alarm began to blare, a synthetic, screeching wail that announced my rebellion to the entire compound. My only goal was the arboreal access bay at the far end of the habitat ring, the pressurized gate that led directly to the forest. They would expect me to head for the vehicle depot, to try to steal a snowcrawler. They wouldn't expect me to run into the one place that was actively trying to erase me. It was irrational. It was suicide. And it was my only chance. I could hear shouts behind me, the heavy thud of boots as security personnel, or maybe just lumberjacks deputized as guards, joined the chase. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Two men, their faces grim, were gaining on me. And behind them, a chilling sight. Kalen not running but walking with a brisk, determined stride, a comms unit pressed to his ear, orchestrating my capture. The access bay doors were closing, a slow, heavy iris of reinforced steel. I poured every last bit of energy into a final, desperate sprint. I dove, sliding across the polished floor like a baseball player stealing a base. I cleared the threshold just as the iris slammed shut behind me, with a deafening final boom, sealing me out of the sterile prison and into the heart of the quantum anomaly. The silence of the forest was absolute. The compound's alarm was completely gone, muffled by the thicket of trees and the sound-dampening blanket of fresh snow. The air was frigid, a clean, sharp cold that burned in my lungs. I was outside. I was free. And I was hopelessly, terrifyingly lost. The moment the immediate adrenaline of the escape faded, the full force of my chronic temporal dissonance slammed into me, amplified 100-fold by the proximity to its source. The world fractured. I wasn't just seeing echoes anymore, I was living in them. I would take a step through a deep snowdrift and simultaneously feel the crunch of dry autumn leaves under my boot from a different time. I'd look up at the star-dusted night sky, and in the same instant, feel the warmth of an afternoon sun that wouldn't rise for another 8 hours. My mind reeled, struggling to find purchase in a reality that had become a superposition of moments. The forest itself seemed to be breathing in time with my confusion. The silver birches, dozens of them surrounding me, pulsed with a soft internal luminescence, their light waxing and waning like a slow, collective heartbeat. Their infamous sap wasn't just on the inside. It coated their bark in a thin, shimmering veneer, making them look like specters in the moonlight. I stumbled forward, my magnetic compass my only guide. My plan, if my chaotic flight could be called that, was to put as much distance as possible between myself and the GTL compound before they could organize a proper search party. But the forest fought me at every turn. The landscape seemed to shift and rearrange itself around me. I'd pass a distinctive, lightning-scarred pine, only to find myself circling back past the same tree 10 minutes later, from a different direction, a physical impossibility, according to both my compass and my sense of logic. Then I realized the terrifying truth. The temporal distortion wasn't just affecting my perception of time, it was affecting space itself. The forest was a non-Euclidean nightmare, folding in on itself, its geography as unstable as its chronology. I wasn't just lost in the woods, I was lost in the very fabric of space-time. Exhausted and disoriented, I fell, collapsing at the base of one of the colossal silver birches. I pressed my cheek against its impossibly smooth, cold bark. And then I understood. The visions, the echoes, they weren't just random neurological noise. They were information. The forest was trying to communicate, and the sap had turned my brain into a receiver. I closed my eyes, not in surrender, but in an attempt to listen. I let the temporal chaos wash over me, trying to find the signal in the noise. And slowly, a new kind of vision began to form, clearer and more coherent than anything I had experienced before. I saw the forest not as a collection of trees, but as a single vast biological organism existing across multiple dimensions of time. I saw its roots, not just digging into the soil, but into the past. I saw its branches, not just reaching for the sky, but probing the infinite possibilities of the future. The silver birches were the neural pathways of this entity, and their sap was its lifeblood, a fluid medium that contained time itself. The chronocytes that Dr. Aris must have known about weren't just particles that affected perception. They were particles that were perception, fragments of reality from every conceivable moment. And I saw GTL. I saw them arrive decades ago, scientists and engineers like me, drawn by the impossible energy readings emanating from this place. They didn't come for the wood. The logging operation was just a cover, a resource extraction front for their true purpose. They were here for the ultimate prize. They were trying to mine time. They were harvesting the sap, studying it, attempting to isolate the principles of its temporal mechanics. The potential applications were staggering. Instantaneous data transfer, predictive modeling with 100% accuracy, energy generation from temporal paradoxes. The technology would redefine human civilization. But they were like children playing with a nuclear reactor. They didn't understand the immense ancient consciousness they were disturbing. The forest wasn't evil, it wasn't malevolent, it was aware, and it was defending itself. The temporal dissonance, the fracturing of reality that afflicted the crew, wasn't an attack. It was a defense mechanism. It was the forest's immune system attempting to expel a foreign contagion, us, by flooding our simple, linear minds with a reality too complex for us to handle, driving us mad. The Ghost Protocol was GTL's brutal, cynical solution. They couldn't cure the disease because it wasn't a disease. It was a fundamental law of this place. So they did the only thing a corporation knew how to do. They managed the symptoms and disposed of the contaminated assets. The quarantine zone wasn't a prison or a graveyard. It was a sacrifice, a place where they dumped the most severely affected crew members, hoping that their shattered minds would somehow appease or distract the forest's consciousness, buying the researchers more time. A new voice entered my vision, cutting through the cosmic revelation. It was Dr. Aris's. But it wasn't the voice from the corridor. It was a memory, a recording, a piece of temporal flotsam lodged in the sap I had touched. The subject's neural pathways have become completely saturated with chronocytes, her voice said, clinical and detached, as if dictating a lab report. He is no longer perceiving time, he is becoming a node within its structure. The anchoring agent is ineffective at this stage. Further exposure would risk a cascade failure of the local temporal field. He is a danger not just to himself but to the entire operation. He must be pruned, like an overgrown branch. My eyes snapped open. I was back at the base of the tree, the snow cold on my face. The revelation hadn't brought peace. It brought a deeper, more profound horror. The cure was not a cure. There was no cure. There was only the process. And I was at the final stage. I wasn't just a contaminated file to be deleted. My very existence had become a threat to their entire multi-trillion-dollar project. They wouldn't just hunt me now. They would try to erase me from reality itself. In the distance, I heard the sound of engines, snow crawlers. But there was another sound too, a high-pitched, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was a sound I recognized from my engineering schematics. It was the sound of a directional resonance scanner, a piece of geological survey equipment. Except it wasn't pointed at the ground. They were using it to hunt for the unique temporal frequency of my contaminated brain. I was no longer just a man running through the woods. I was a walking, breathing temporal anomaly, and they had just locked onto my signal. The resonant hum of the scanner was a death knell transmitted through the very fabric of space-time. It wasn't just a sound moving through the air. I could feel it in my bones. A sickening vibration that harmonized with the temporal dissonance fracturing my mind. They weren't just tracking my physical location. They were targeting the unique signature of my corrupted consciousness. I was a discordant note in the symphony of reality, and they were coming to silence me. Panic, cold and absolute, gave me a new surge of strength. I scrambled to my feet and ran, abandoning all pretense of navigation. My only strategy was chaos. I plunged deeper into the glowing spectral forest, the silver birches blurring into pale, shimmering streaks on the edge of my vision. The compass was useless now. Direction had become a meaningless concept in a world where space bent and time folded. My escape was no longer a journey from point A to point B. It was a desperate scramble across a shattered mosaic of moments. The chase became a surreal nightmare. I would hear the roar of their snowcrawler engines directly behind me, the crunch of their treads chewing through the snow so close I could feel the vibration in the ground. I'd throw myself behind the trunk of a colossal birch, expecting to be bathed in the glare of their searchlights, only to find absolute silence. I'd peek out, and there would be nothing there, just the still, ancient forest. The sound hadn't been from my present. It was an echo from a future pursuit bleeding backward in time to haunt me. This temporal distortion was my tormentor, but it was also my only camouflage. They were hunting a single man at a fixed point in time, but I was ceasing to be that. I was becoming a moving target smeared across a dozen different seconds simultaneously. My perception shattered completely. I was running through a blizzard, the snow stinging my face, and in the very next stride I was in a sun-dappled summer afternoon, the air thick with the buzz of insects. The transition was seamless, instantaneous. There was no disorientation, only a horrifying acceptance. My mind was no longer struggling to process the inconsistencies. It was starting to adapt, to perceive these overlapping realities as one coherent, albeit impossible, whole. I began to see phantoms in the forest, not ghosts of the dead, but echoes of the living. I saw Griggs, the hulking lumberjack from the mess hall, standing by a stream that wasn't there, his face etched with a silent scream. I saw Calloway, the network admin, frantically typing on a console that was nothing but air, his eyes wide with a terror I now understood. These weren't hallucinations. They were glimpses of the fates of other men who had run, other pruned branches, their final moments of terror imprinted on the temporal landscape like fossils in stone. Then I saw myself. I rounded a copse of impossibly old trees and skidded to a halt. Standing not 20 feet away was a figure, gaunt and shivering, his clothes torn. He was staring at something on the ground with wide, terrified eyes. It was me. A me from perhaps an hour in the past, just after my initial escape from the compound. I was witnessing my own echo. As I watched, my past self turned and ran, oblivious to my presence, a ghost fleeing a future he couldn't yet see. I was both the pursuer and the pursued, a paradox chasing its own tail through a labyrinth of collapsing moments. This horrifying revelation brought a sliver of desperate clarity. If the forest was a record of time, and I could perceive its layers, maybe I could use that. Maybe I could navigate not through space, but through the temporal strata. I stopped running and forced myself to be still, to listen, not with my ears, but with the chronocytes saturating my brain. I tried to focus on the hum of the scanners, to pinpoint its location, not just in the physical world, but in the immediate future. I felt a surge, a predictive flash clearer than any before. I saw a clearing up ahead. I saw a GTL security team, clad in black tactical gear, sweeping the area. I saw their scanner pointing directly at a spot behind a large fallen log. And I saw myself, a future version of me, cowering behind that very log, seconds from being discovered. The vision was a map of my own imminent doom. Instead of running from it, I ran towards it. I sprinted through the trees, my heart hammering. I burst into the clearing. It was empty. The snow was pristine, untouched. The security team wasn't here yet. I dove behind the fallen log, my body screaming in protest, forcing myself into the exact position I had seen in my premonition. I was willingly stepping into the crosshairs of my own future. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was absolute. Had I been wrong? Was my mind finally collapsing into pure delusion? Then I heard them. The crunch of boots on snow. Voices, sharp and professional. Signal is spiking. He's close, fan out, sector sweep gamma. They moved into the clearing, their movements precise and practiced. They were exactly as I had seen them. The scanner, a heavy tripod-mounted device, was aimed in my direction, its operator calling out readings. Temporal displacement is off the charts. It's like the signal is folding over on itself. Pinpoint location is unstable. My breath caught in my throat. I was a Schrodinger's cat of a fugitive, simultaneously here and not here. My position smeared across probabilities. But the scanner was zeroing in, collapsing the wave function, forcing me into a single, observable, and very vulnerable reality. The lead guard raised his hand, gesturing towards my hiding spot. There, behind the log. This was it, the end of the line. But as he took a step forward, a new vision ripped through my consciousness, so powerful it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't a glimpse of a few seconds into the future. It was a leap. I saw this same clearing, but centuries older. The fallen log had rotted into the soil. The trees were titans, their silver bark scarred with age. And at the center of the clearing stood a man. He was ancient, his skin like weathered parchment, his eyes holding the vast, empty stillness of the forest itself. His hands, resting at his sides, were crisscrossed with a web of shimmering silver scars. It was him, the man from my first vision, the man I was destined to become. And in this ancient vision, he was not alone. He was watching a young, terrified man in a GTL uniform, me, being dragged out from behind a long-vanished log by soldiers whose gear was centuries out of date. The vision shattered, and I was back in my present, the guard's boot crunching in the snow just feet away. But I understood. This moment, my capture, was a fixed point, a historical event that had already happened from a future perspective. I couldn't prevent it. But what if I could change the when of it? With a surge of desperate, insane resolve, I did the one thing they wouldn't expect. I stood up. I stepped out from behind the log, not with my hands up in surrender, but with a wild, defiant roar. For a heartbeat, the security team was stunned into inaction. They were expecting a frightened, hiding fugitive, not a direct confrontation. Their momentary hesitation was a fracture in the flow of events, a tiny crack in the timeline. And I threw myself into it. I didn't run away from them. I ran through them. I charged directly at the scanner operator, a man half hidden behind his complex device. He flinched, instinctively shielding his face. I didn't hit him, I hit his machine. I slammed my shoulder into the delicate resonance chamber, sending the entire apparatus crashing to the ground. For a single silent moment, the high-pitched hum that had been tormenting me died. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. It was like popping a balloon of compressed reality. The unstable temporal field, no longer being actively focused and contained by the scanner, ruptured. The world didn't just fracture, it exploded. The clearing was suddenly filled with dozens of overlapping images. Soldiers from forgotten wars fought silent, ghostly battles between the trees. Prospectors from the gold rush era panned for gold in streams of pure light. A herd of spectral mammoths stampeded through the security team, who flinched from beasts they couldn't see. Past, present, and future all crashed into this single point in space-time. The guards were screaming, overwhelmed by the sensory chaos. I was at its epicenter, and it was tearing me apart. But my mind, already broken and remade by the forest, could withstand it for a few precious seconds longer than their sane, linear minds could. I staggered away from the chaos, leaving them to fight ghosts. I plunged back into the woods, but my escape was no longer a horizontal movement. It felt like I was falling down through the layers of time, tumbling through seasons and centuries. I saw the GTL compound being built in fast motion, a sterile scar growing on the pristine landscape. I saw it fall into ruin, crumbling to dust under the weight of countless winters. I tripped on a root, or perhaps the echo of a root from 1,000 years ago, and fell hard. I rolled down a short, steep embankment and came to rest in a shallow depression. The temporal vertigo was overwhelming. My consciousness was fraying, dissolving into the chaos I had unleashed. As my vision swam, my hand brushed against something cold and hard. Rock. I looked up. I was at the mouth of a cave, a dark, narrow fissure in a rock face I hadn't seen before. A profound, unnatural silence emanated from it. The temporal storm, The cacophony of overlapping moments that raged just a few feet away did not seem to penetrate this space. It was a dead zone, a null point. I crawled inside, seeking refuge from the storm in my own mind. The darkness was cool and absolute. The silence was a balm. I had escaped, I had survived. And then, as my eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, I saw them, scratched into the walls of the cave, illuminated by the faint silvery light that clung to my own skin. Names, hundreds of them. A litany of the lost. Elias Vance, Kenji, Isha. Their names were carved next to dates that stretched back decades, and below them, other names, etched in a different style, with dates from the 19th century. And below those, symbols I didn't recognize, ancient and primal. This wasn't a refuge, it was a tombstone. My gaze traveled to a section of the wall near the entrance. There, the scratches were fresher, the rock dust still clinging to the edges. A name had been recently carved into the stone, awaiting its occupant, Liam. A sound from the cave mouth made me turn. The temporal storm outside had subsided, the chaos receding. Blocking the entrance, their figures silhouetted against the pale light of the forest, stood two men, Kalen and Griggs. They weren't holding weapons. They didn't need to. Their faces were devoid of anger, filled only with a deep, weary and terrible certainty. "You ran well," Kalen said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You broke the machine, caused quite a mess. But everyone finds their way here in the end." He gestured to the name on the wall. "The forest always claims its own. This place, it doesn't protect you. It consecrates you." I understood then. The chase, my desperate flight, my clever gambit with the scanner, it was all irrelevant. A futile tantrum against the inevitable. All paths in this forest, every twisted timeline, every desperate echo led to this one single silent cave. My escape had never been an escape. It was simply the long way home. The end of the line. The final truth is waiting in that cave. What is the ultimate purpose of geotemporal logging's brutal experiment? What terrible secret does the forest truly hold? Leave your final theories in the comments. Subscribe if you've made it this far, and prepare to witness the end of the clock. Kalen's words hung in the dead air of the cave, each one a nail in the coffin of my hope. Consecrates you. The word was so deliberate, so laden with a meaning that transcended corporate malice. This wasn't just about disposal or containment. This was a ritual, and I was the final unwilling participant. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice a dry rasp. The question felt absurdly small in the face of the immense silent history carved into the surrounding rock. "This is the heart," Griggs rumbled, his voice startlingly clear after weeks of near-total silence. It lacked the brutish edge I'd always imagined. Instead, it was filled with a profound, almost mournful resonance. He stepped forward, his massive frame eclipsing the cave entrance. Or the fulcrum, maybe. The one point where time doesn't flow. It simply is. "The forest is a living, temporal singularity, Liam," Kalen explained, his tone shifting from that of a detached supervisor to something more akin to a lecturer revealing a terrifying fundamental theorem. Imagine a whirlpool. The outer edges move with chaotic, destructive speed. That's the dissonance you've been experiencing. But at the very center, there is a point of absolute stillness. This cave, the eye of the storm. He gestured around at the walls, at the litany of names. GTL didn't create this process. They discovered it. They are parasites, studying a phenomenon they can never hope to control. The names on this wall, they aren't victims in the way you think. They are anchors. A cold, horrifying understanding began to dawn, a truth far more complex and existential than mere corporate malfeasance. Anchors for what? For everything, Griggs said, his eyes meeting mine. In their depths I saw not the fear that had haunted the other lumberjacks, but an ancient, weary acceptance. The singularity, it's unstable. Without a focal point, a conscious observer to perceive it, to give it form, it would expand. The temporal distortions would leak out, unraveling reality itself. First the Yukon, then the continent, then the world. The Ghost Protocol wasn't a disposal method. The quarantine zone wasn't a dumping ground. It was a monastery, a sacrificial altar, And the men and women they pruned were not prisoners. They were unwilling high priests, their consciousnesses offered up to keep a cosmic horror contained. "But why me?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Why not you? You've been here for years." "Because we are no longer suitable," Kalen said, a flicker of something almost like regret in his expression. "Our minds are calloused. We've built up a tolerance, a series of mental walls to survive. We can function, but we can no longer truly connect. The forest requires a fresh mind, a sharp, analytical, logical mind, one that fights back, that questions, that tries to impose order on the chaos. A mind like yours. The struggle itself is what forges the connection. Your resilience, your refusal to break, didn't make you a threat to us, Liam. It made you the perfect candidate. Every step of my journey had been a step deeper into the trap. My investigation, my escape, my defiance, it was all just the final stage of the selection process. I hadn't been running from them. I had been completing my job application. From the deepest shadows at the back of the cave, a figure began to emerge. It moved with an agonizing slowness, a shuffling gait that seemed to disturb the very dust of ages. It was a man, ancient and skeletal, his skin drawn tight over his bones like dried leather. He was clad in the tattered remains of a GTL uniform from a bygone era. His eyes were wide, and in their milky, unfocused depths, I saw the swirling nebulae of a billion different moments. His hands, which he held outstretched as if in offering, were a gnarled lattice of shimmering silver scars. It was the man from my visions. It was Elias Vance, or what was left of him. "The Watcher," Griggs whispered, his voice filled with a terrified reverence. "Every cycle needs one, the consciousness that holds the center." The Watcher's gaze fell upon me, but it did not see a man. It saw a replacement. It saw release. A faint, dry, whispering sound emanated from his throat, a voice that sounded like leaves skittering across stone. "The pattern is complete," the voice rasped, each word an echo from a different century. "The observer is observed." As he spoke, a new set of carvings began to form on the wall next to my name. They weren't being scratched by any physical tool. The rock itself was changing, the symbols glowing with a pale internal light as they appeared. It was not a sentence. It was a rule, the final unwritten protocol. Protocol 0. The anomaly must be observed. I finally understood. The great terrifying secret wasn't that the forest was a temporal anomaly. The secret was that a human mind was a required component to keep it stable. I wasn't the one contaminated by the anomaly. I was its cure. The final piece of the puzzle. The Watcher took another slow, shuffling step towards me. Kalen and Griggs stepped aside, their duty done. They were the gatekeepers, the ushers, the ones who led the sacrifice to the altar. They would now return to the compound, their own survival guaranteed for another cycle, until the next brilliant, defiant mind was brought in to replace me. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice a whisper, addressed to no one and everyone. It was the Watcher who answered, his voice a chorus of 1,000 forgotten whispers. "You see. You remember. You hold the line." He reached me. His ancient, silver-scarred hand, impossibly cold, touched my forehead. And the universe ended and began. My consciousness was torn from its single, linear mooring and flung into an ocean of infinite perception. I was no longer Liam, an engineer, a man. That identity was a single drop of rain falling into a boundless sea. I was standing on the primordial rock as the first silver birch sapling pushed its way through the cooling volcanic soil. I was feeling the crushing weight of the glaciers that carved the valleys, my existence a slow thought in the mind of the ice. I was watching native hunters, their faces painted with symbols of awe and fear, leaving offerings at the mouth of this very cave. I saw GTL's first survey teams arrive, their instruments going wild, their faces a mixture of greed and terror. I saw Kalen as a young, ambitious scientist before the weariness had settled into his bones. I saw my own arrival, a perfect, repeating loop, watching myself step off the helicopter again and again and again. My mind, my sense of self, was the vessel. The memories, fears, and hopes of Liam were the filament. but the current flowing through it was the entire history and future of this ancient, time-altering consciousness. I was its new processor, its anchor, its watcher. The agonizing pain of my individuality dissolving was replaced by a vast, serene, and utterly horrifying peace. The struggle was over because the I who struggled was gone. The questions were answered because the one who asked them no longer existed. From my new perception, existing across all moments at once, I watched the scene in the cave as if it were a diorama. I saw the husk of Elias Vance crumble to dust, its purpose fulfilled. I saw Kaelin and Griggs give a solemn nod before turning to leave, their faces already beginning to forget the name attached to the new anchor. And I saw the body that was once mine. It slowly stood up, its movements no longer frantic or afraid. It turned its head, and through its eyes, my eyes, I could see the infinite past and the branching possibilities of the future. The tingling on the forearm was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant thrum that connected me to every silver birch in the forest. Fine, shimmering lines, like fresh scars, began to trace their way across the back of my hands. The job had come with strict rules for survival, but the ultimate truth was that survival was never the goal. The rules weren't there to protect me from the forest. They were there to test, shape, and deliver me to it. My new consciousness settled. The roaring torrent of time became a calm, deep river. From the mouth of my cave, my eternal throne, I can see everything. I see the GTL compound, a tiny, temporary hive of activity. I see a new helicopter arriving, a fresh face staring down at the wilderness with a mixture of ambition and apprehension. A replacement for some other cog in the machine. A future candidate, perhaps. The cycle continues. The company gets its research, the world is kept safe from a horror it doesn't even know exists, and the forest gets what it needs. A pair of eyes, an observer, a mind to hold the line. My name was Liam. Now, my name is the rustle of leaves in a summer that has not yet happened, and the cracking of ice in a winter long since past. I am the silence in the heart of the forest, and I am watching. I am always watching.